Every single cent, he said, sliding the file across the tray like it was nothing. Lender by lender. Interest by interest. I know exactly how buried you are, Aaliyah. The room went silent. Sal and Rico didn't move. They didn't need to. Dante wanted her to feel watched. He wanted her to understand there was no version of tonight where she walked away untouched. One night in my suite, he said, tattooed fingers grazing her waist, and every debt disappears. She stood frozen, tray trembling, the blue liqueur catching the city lights behind her. Her children's faces flashed behind her eyes. The calls, the threats, the exhaustion. Dante was the danger in this room, but he was also the only door left open. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. The tray didn't shake in her hands. That was the first thing Dante noticed, and it irritated him more than if she dropped it. He'd seen women fold under less. He'd watched grown men who'd bled other men out in warehouses without blinking, go soft and stammering the moment he mentioned a number. Numbers had a way of doing that. They stripped a person down to the arithmetic of their life, what they owed, what they were worth, what they'd trade to stop the bleeding. Aaliyah just stood there, spine straight, the decanter of blue liqueur catching the low gold light like something underwater. She hadn't looked at the file again. She was looking at him. You memorized it, she said. Not a question. I read things once. Dante leaned back into the leather, unhurried, the way he did everything. His guards flanked the room like furniture, Sal by the bookshelf, Rico near the window, both men trained to be invisible until they weren't. 22,000 to Sally Mae. 14 to a hospital that overcharged you by half. A car note underwater since March. Should I keep going, or does the shape of it speak for itself? You had someone dig through my life. I had someone confirm what your face already tells me every night you work this floor. He turned his glass a quarter turn on the marble, an old habit, the kind of small motion that made people watch his hands instead of his eyes. You're tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. That's not an insult. It's an observation. Behind her, the city glittered on, indifferent, 40 floors down and 1,000 miles from anything that mattered to either of them right now. So this is a negotiation, she said. This is a solution. He said it plainly, the way he'd say the time or the weather. No performance in it, which was worse than if there had been. Performance could be dismissed. This was just fact, delivered the way facts get delivered by men who've never once had to raise their voice to be obeyed. One night, my suite. In the morning, every lender on that page gets a wire transfer that makes your name disappear from their books. Not a loan, not a favor you'll owe later. Clean. And if I say no, then you go back to pouring drinks for men who tip better than they see you. And in 6 months, a collections agency garnishes what's left of your check, and your kids ask why the lights keep going out. He said this without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder. I'm not threatening you, Aaliyah. I'm telling you what's already coming. I'm just offering you a door out of it. Sal shifted his weight by the shelf. Barely, a boxer's stillness. And Aaliyah felt it more than saw it, the way prey feels a shadow cross a field. Rico didn't move at all. That was somehow worse. She set the tray down on the table, slow, deliberate, the crystal glasses ringing softly against gold. Her hands were steady, whatever was happening beneath her ribs. And something cold and fast, the sound of her own pulse suddenly very loud in her ears. She didn't let it reach her fingers. You could have just paid it off, she said. Quietly, anonymously, if you wanted to play savior. I don't want to play savior. For the first time, something shifted in his face. Not softness, nothing so simple as that, but attention. Real attention, the kind he rarely gave anything that wasn't a problem worth solving. I want to know what's left of a person after you take away everything they're afraid of losing. Most people, there's nothing left. They just fold into the shape of their relief. He studied her the way he'd study a ledger with numbers that didn't add up right. I don't think that's what happens with you. You don't know me. No, he agreed. That's the interesting part. The room held its breath around them. The guards, the skyline, the untouched blue liqueur cooling in its decanter. Aaliyah thought of her daughter's school shoes, worn through at the toe. She thought of the collections calls that came at dinner, always at dinner, like they knew. She thought of her own voice, unused in years, rusted shut somewhere behind her sternum. Then she looked at Dante Romano. Really looked, The way she hadn't let herself since she started this shift, and understood, with total clarity, that a man like this did not make offers. He made openings. And what walked through them was always, eventually, his to keep. I have terms, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise. Closer to hunger. I'm listening. Dante didn't smile often, and when he did, it never reached the parts of his face that mattered. This time it did. Barely, a flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone as fast as it came. It was the look of a man who'd just watched a locked door creak, not open, but creak, and found the sound more interesting than anything behind it. Terms, he repeated, tasting the word. Go on. Aaliyah folded her hands in front of her apron, the posture of a woman who'd spent years learning how to look calm while carrying something heavy. Not your sweet. That's not a term. That's a refusal. It's a counteroffer. She kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to keep it level with landlords, with loan officers, with every man who'd ever sat across a desk from her and mistaken her composure for weakness. You said one night. You didn't say where. Sal, by the bookshelf, shifted again. This time enough that Dante lifted 2 fingers off the armrest, a small gesture, and the big man went still like a dog called off a scent. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a reminder. Everyone in this room moved at Dante's tempo, whether they realized it or not. You want to negotiate the venue, Dante said, for a night you haven't agreed to yet. I'm agreeing right now. She let that sit a second, watching it land. One night. Total clearance. Every lender, every cent, in writing before I set foot anywhere. But you come to me. My terms, my ground. Your ground. He said it slow, turning it over like a coin he suspected was counterfeit. You have an apartment with a broken lock and a landlord 3 months from evicting you. Is that the ground you mean? It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was information, deployed the way he deployed everything, precisely to see what it dislodged. Aaliyah felt the old heat rise in her chest, the particular anger of being fully seen by someone who'd earned none of that sight. Not my apartment, she said. There's a club, Delancey and Ninth. You won't have heard of it. Something crossed his face then, quick and genuine, the first unrehearsed thing she'd seen from him all night. The Blue Room. Her stomach dropped half an inch. You know it. I know of it. Failing jazz club, going under for 2 years. Owner's been laundering losses through a cousin's bar permit to keep the doors open another season. He said it the way another man might recite a baseball score. No malice, just data, filed and retrieved. You performed there. Before. She didn't elaborate, and something in her tone closed the subject with a door slam quiet enough that only he seemed to hear it. Dante studied her for a long moment. Down below, the city kept moving, oblivious, a smear of light and traffic and other people's smaller problems. Up here, the air had gone very still, the kind of stillness that came before weather. You want to take me somewhere, he said finally. You control. Where the geography favors you instead of me. That's not submission, Aaliyah. That's strategy. Call it what you want. I'm calling it interesting. He rose from the chair, unhurried, buttoning his jacket with the same precision he did everything, and crossed the small distance between them until she had to tilt her chin up to hold his eyes. This close, she could smell him. Cedar, gun oil, the particular cologne of men who never had to raise their voice because someone else always did the shouting for them. Most people, when they're drowning, grab the first hand extended. You're negotiating the shape of the rescue. Maybe I don't trust the hand. Smart. His gaze dropped, briefly, to the tray between them, the empty decanter, the crystal glasses catching gold light. Fine. Your club. Your terms. But understand something, Aaliyah, I don't lose. Not at cards. Not at business. Not at whatever this becomes. If you're planning something clever in that room, I'll see it before you finish setting it up. Then it's not clever, she said. It's just true. For a second, neither of them moved. Behind him, Rico's eyes flicked towards Sal, an unspoken question neither dared voice aloud. Dante Romano did not get led. He led, and yet here he was, tilting his head slightly, considering terms from a woman holding an empty tray, like she'd said something worth the weight of his attention. I'll have my lawyer draft the release papers by morning, he said. Full clearance, signed before you walk through that door tomorrow night. No games, no fine print. He stepped back, straightening his cuff, already retreating into the cool remove she'd first walked in on. You have one night to figure out what you're really offering me, Aaliyah. I suggest you use it. He turned toward the window, dismissing her the way he dismissed everyone. Total, absolute, without another glance. But as she gathered the tray and walked toward the door, she felt his eyes follow her the entire way and understood, with a small cold certainty, that she had just won something and lost something in the same breath, and wouldn't know which was which until it was far too late to take it back. The club hadn't changed, and that was the cruelest part. Aaliyah stood in the doorway of the blue room at 9:30, keys still warm in her palm from the lock she'd fought for 3 full minutes. The same lock that had always stuck, the same door that swelled in summer heat and never quite sat right in its frame. Inside, dust hung suspended in the single working spotlight, turning slow gold in air that smelled like old bourbon and older velvet. 12 tables, a stage the size of a generous rug, a piano nobody had tuned in 2 years, its lacquer gone matte with neglect. She used to know every splinter in that stage floor, used to know which board creaked under a heel and which held silent, back when her voice was the only currency that mattered in this room. Marcus, the owner, had let her in without questions, though his eyes had asked plenty. She hadn't answered any of them. Some things you didn't explain until they were finished happening. By 10, she had one small table set at the center of the floor. 2 chairs, the blue liqueur, the cheap kind, the drugstore kind, nothing like the crystal decanter from Dante's penthouse, poured into 2 mismatched glasses. And beside them, spread flat and deliberate, every page from that file, every lender, every number, laid out like evidence, or an altar, she hadn't decided which. At 10:15, 2 black SUVs stopped outside a building that hadn't seen a luxury car idle at its curb in a decade. Dante came in alone. That surprised her. She'd expected Sal and Rico shadowing him through the door, the same wall of muscle that had flanked his chair in the Sky Lounge. Instead, he stood just inside the entrance in a dark overcoat, scanning the room the way a man reads a room he's deciding whether to respect or dismiss. His guard stayed outside, engine running, a decision that told her more than anything he could have said. You came without them, she said. They'd only make you nervous. He shrugged out of the coat, draping it over the back of a chair no one had reupholstered since the Clinton administration. And I don't need an audience for this. For what exactly? That's what I came to find out. His eyes moved over the small table, the papers, the cheap blue liqueur, and something flickered behind them. Not distaste, she noted, but recognition, like a man recalculating an equation he'd assumed was simple. You didn't bring me here to seduce me, Aaliyah. No, you brought me here to show me something. She gestured to the chair across from her own, and after a long moment, he sat, folding into a chair built for men half his presence, in a room built for a woman's music, not a boss's ledger. The contrast should have made him look smaller. It didn't. It made the room look like it had been waiting for exactly this kind of reckoning. Drink, she said, nodding at the glass. He lifted it, studied the color against the low light, and drank. No ceremony, no suspicion, which told her he trusted his own read of people more than he feared her capacity to poison him. The liqueur was sharp, cheaper, honest in a way the crystal decanter upstairs had never been. This is the same drink, he said. From the tray. Same color. Different drink entirely. She sat across from him, spine straight, hands flat on the table beside her file. That's the point. You've been drinking the expensive version of everything your whole life and calling it the truth. I wanted you to taste what the truth actually costs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere behind the bar, an old refrigerator hummed, the only sound in a room built to hold music, and now holding something far more dangerous. 2 people testing whether silence could be a language. You're stalling, Dante said finally, though there was no accusation in it, only curiosity. The night was supposed to start with silk sheets and end with a wire transfer. Instead, I'm sitting in a dead jazz club drinking rail liquor across a table covered in your medical debt. I'm not stalling. She met his eyes fully now, the first time she'd allowed herself the full weight of that gaze without flinching from it. I'm negotiating the only currency I have left that you haven't already priced. You wanted a challenge, Dante. A person who didn't fold the second you named your terms. She reached for the second glass, untouched, and slid it toward him. So here's my counter. Before this night becomes anything else, you're going to listen to something you can't buy, price, or own. She stood and walked toward the small, dust-covered stage, the old boards creaking exactly where she remembered. And for the first time in over 2 years, Aaliyah stepped into the light meant for a voice she'd buried under bills and exhaustion and the slow erosion of everything she used to be. Dante watched her go and did not move to stop her. She hadn't sung in front of another human being in 2 years and 4 months. She knew the exact count because grief keeps better ledgers than any bank. The spotlight found her without effort. It had always found her here, back when this stage was the only place she'd felt entirely like herself instead of like something rented out by the hour to other people's needs. She stood at its center, no microphone, no band, just the dead air of an empty club and one man sitting alone at a table covered in the wreckage of her finances. Dante hadn't moved. He sat with his elbows on his knees now, leaning forward slightly, the posture of a man who'd forgotten, for once, to perform stillness. She started without introduction, without apology. An old standard, one her grandmother used to hum over the stove, about a woman who loved a man who never once deserved the loving. Her voice came out rough at first, 2 years of disuse scraping the edges, but it steadied fast, the way muscle memory does, the body remembering what the mind had tried to forget for its own protection. By the second verse, something in the room changed. It wasn't the acoustics. The Blue Room had always had strange acoustics, too much velvet and not enough ceiling height, a sound engineer's minor tragedy. It was something else, the particular alchemy of an unguarded voice meeting a man who spent his entire life surrounded by people too frightened to be unguarded around him. Dante watched her the way he read a balance sheet he didn't trust, carefully, for the seam, the discrepancy, the tell. Except there wasn't one. That was the discrepancy. Aaliyah, mid-song, wasn't performing gratitude or fear or desperate charm the way every other person in his orbit performed for him, consciously or not. She was simply telling the truth in the only language she had left that hadn't been repossessed. He looked down at the papers on the table between empty chairs, her hospital bills, her daughter's tuition deposit, the interest rate on a loan that had metastasized past all reason. And for the first time since Anton had slid that folder across his desk 2 weeks ago, the numbers stopped being numbers. They became a timeline. A woman working triple shifts while raising 2 kids and still finding, somewhere, the discipline to keep her voice from atrophying completely, even as everything else in her life was stripped down to the studs. He'd built his offer believing he was rescuing her. Now, watching her sing in a room that still remembered every note she used to give it for free, he understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that he hadn't been offering rescue at all. He'd been offering a transaction dressed up as mercy and mistaking her calm for consent. The song ended on a low note that hung in the dusty air a full 3 seconds before dissolving. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She stood in the light and let the silence do what silence does to men and used to being confronted with anything they couldn't immediately price. "You could have had a career," Dante said finally, his voice quieter than she'd heard it all night, stripped of the boardroom cadence he wore like armor. "A real one." "I did." She stepped down off the stage, her heels finding the same worn grooves in the floor they'd always found. "Then rent happened. Then my mother's chemo happened. Then Marcus couldn't keep the lights on, and neither could I." She sat back down across from him, the file still spread between them like a wound left open on purpose. "You didn't buy a night with a woman who's desperate, Dante. You bought a night with a woman who used to have a name people said with respect, before debt made her invisible." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his empty glass in slow circles against the table, the same habit he had upstairs, except here, in this room, it looked less like control and more like a man buying himself time to feel something he didn't have a category for. "I read your file and saw leverage," he said finally. "I should have read it and seen a person. Most people don't bother with the difference. I'm not most people." He looked up, and for the first time all night, there was no performance behind his eyes at all, just a man confronting, with visible discomfort, the shape of his own cruelty reflected back at him in the worn floorboards of a dying jazz club. "I think I owe you an apology I don't know how to give." "You don't owe me an apology," Aaliyah said quietly, gathering the papers with steady hands. "You owe me the truth about what happens now that you've heard it." Outside, engines idled. Inside, the dust settled slow through the single spotlight, and Dante Romano sat very still, doing something he almost never did, reconsidering, from the ground up, exactly what kind of man he'd walked into this room believing himself to be. Dawn came up gray over the East River, the kind of light that made even expensive things look tired. Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, still in yesterday's blouse, staring at her phone like it might bite her. She hadn't slept. Not because anything happened in that club worth losing sleep over. Nothing had. Not in the way the contract implied. Not in the way she'd braced herself for on the walk home at 2 a.m. with her shoes in her hand and her mind refusing to settle. Dante had left the blue room a little after midnight. He'd folded her file back into its manila sleeve, set it on the table between them like something he no longer wanted to hold, and said only, "Get some rest. You'll hear from me." No touch. No terms restated. No collection on the debt he'd offered to erase. She'd walked home certain it was a trick, that men like Dante Romano didn't spend that kind of leverage and walk away with empty hands, that somewhere between the club and sunrise the other shoe would drop, heavier than the first. Her phone buzzed at 6:52 a.m. The notification came first, her bank, an alert she didn't recognize the shape of because she'd never once in her adult life seen a balance move in the right direction by this much. She opened it with her thumbs shaking, and there it was, the loan servicer, zeroed out. The hospital account, zeroed out. The car note, gone. Numbers she'd carried so long they'd become part of her spine, simply erased. Every lender on that page, cleared exactly as promised, time-stamped an hour before she'd even woken up. Beneath it, a single text, no name attached because he'd known she wouldn't need one. "You didn't spend the night. You earned it. I paid for the song." She read it 4 times. Then she set the phone face down on the mattress and put both hands over her mouth. And for a long moment she didn't know if what was coming up her throat was laughter or grief, or some third thing that didn't have a proper name. Relief, maybe, but relief with teeth, the kind that made you suspicious of its own size. Across the city, in a penthouse 40 floors above a skyline that had watched 1,000 transactions and never once blinked, Dante Romano stood at the window with a coffee he hadn't touched, going over the numbers Anton had sold him 2 weeks ago like they were a stranger's handwriting. He'd built his life on a simple premise. Everyone had a price, and the only skill worth mastering was finding it faster than the other man. It had never once failed him. Not with unions, not with judges, not with rivals who thought their silence was for sale to the highest bidder instead of the most patient one. Aaliyah had broken the premise without raising her voice above a whisper. He'd gone into that club expecting to buy a night and walked out having paid for a truth he hadn't budgeted for. That some things didn't yield to leverage because they weren't for sale in the first place, and that he'd spent decades mistaking the absence of resistance for the presence of consent. It unsettled him more than any rival ever had. Rivals, he understood. Rivals wanted the same things he wanted, just fewer of them. Aaliyah had wanted something he didn't have a line item for. He set the coffee down, and for the first time in longer than he could name, allowed himself something close to admiration for a person he hadn't managed to own. Sal knocked once, entering with the morning briefing folder under his arm, schedules, a shipment out of Red Hook, a councilman who needed reminding of an old favor. Dante took it without looking up from the window. "The transfer went through clean?" he asked. 6:52, like you said. Sal hesitated at the door, the kind of hesitation a man only risked with a boss he'd worked for a long time. "You want eyes kept on her?" Dante considered the skyline a moment longer, the way smoke from some rooftop kitchen bent sideways in the wind, the way the city below kept moving without any awareness of the small, seismic thing that had shifted in a dead jazz club the night before. "Not eyes," he said finally. "Not yet." He turned from the window. The coffee had gone cold, and he didn't seem to mind. "Find out what she needs to reopen that club," he said, quietly. "No contracts. No terms." He paused, and something almost like a smile moved across his face, gone as fast as it arrived. The look of a man who'd just discovered a new kind of game, one with rules he didn't yet fully understand, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he wanted to keep playing it anyway. "Let's see what she does when nobody's collecting."